You've always cherished the hours between 7 and 9 p.m. Those are the hours where your son is winding down for bed, your wife is usually done with her studies, and if you're lucky, you're done with work too. Not every night, but more often than not, those 2 hours before you put your son to bed are family time. You play a board game, or watch a movie, or just hang out in the same room, reading a book while your wife knits and your son draws on the floor. In the winter, when it's cold, sometimes you'll have a fire going. Your son usually draws his classmates or things that happened at school. Sometimes he'll draw the neighbor's dog or a sunset or those little things that kids have more time to appreciate than we do. But lately, he's been drawing a monster. It would be one thing if he was going through a phase and drawing a bunch of monsters, but he's been drawing the same one over and over again. And after about a week, you ask him what's going on, and he tells you he's drawing himself. You brush it off as just a silly little kid phase, but after a month, you decide you really need to get to the bottom of things. You try to explain to him that he doesn't have sharp teeth or claws, and the only hair he has is on his head. But he insists that the drawings look just like him. A month later, and the beast has changed. The teeth longer, the arms more numerous. But your son still insists he's just drawing himself. You finally decide he needs some professional help, just to make sure everything's okay, and you hire a counselor. You let them talk alone up in his room. It was a matter of seconds between when you heard the screams and when you burst through the door, but all that was left of the therapist was a red puddle on the ground. Your son still looks like your son, but when he smiles, it's bloody. Your wife left after that, but someone's got to take care of your child. So now, on quiet nights, it's just you, him, and whatever date you've brought home that day. To tune out the screams, you just throw on the podcast Inside Your House by Annie Marie Morgan and Kevin Schrock, with today's episode written by Annie Marie Morgan. Episode 11, Minerva's Owl. My little cousin Minnie is a talented artist, but the owl painting was by far her worst work. I'd been working with her all summer, and I could honestly say it was the only one that appeared to be done by a girl her age. She was just 6 years old, but already showing talent that was impressive, bordering on prodigious. The main issue was that the proportions were just not right. It had a pronounced neck and shoulders, giving it an almost human-shaped silhouette. She'd drawn it flying against the sky, so it was hard to get a sense of scale, but it felt like she'd painted it to be very large. The feather pattern was all wrong. It didn't have the white face and golden back of a barn owl. The face was pale, but the rest of the body was a sickly gray. Honestly, it skeeved me out. I tried to break it to her gently, telling her that the sky looked great and peppering in a few compliments before I tried to figure out what had gone wrong. Then I said, "So what made you want to paint an owl? Did you see one, or did you look at any pictures while you painted this one?"
"Yeah, I saw one. He lives in the woods, but he comes to the house at night," she replied.
"That's awesome," I told her. "So it's great to work from your memory, but sometimes if you can't look at something for too long, you might need to look at some pictures too, because it can be hard to remember all the details right."
"I don't need a picture, Sally,"
Minnie said. She rolled her eyes in that sassy kid way.
"He poses for me."
"What do you mean?" I asked.
"When it gets dark out, he comes to my window and we look at each other," she said, playing with her blonde curls absent-mindedly. That was absolutely the creepiest way she could have put it. But kids are bad at explaining things, so I decided to not probe further. She continued, "I painted that when he was here, but I made it daytime because I wanted it to be prettier."
"Do you want to take a look at some pictures of owls during the day?" I asked. "Since you mostly see them at night?" Minnie readily agreed to this, and we went to the computer. I wondered if maybe the one she was seeing was a juvenile. Some of the adults did have a bit of gray to them, but the babies had lots of gray down and a lanky, skinny look. Do you think the one you saw might be a baby? I asked her as we scrolled through more pictures. No, she replied bluntly. Why not? I asked. Because that would be a big baby, she said, and then laughed. When he looks in my window, his feet are on the ground. She looked back at the computer screen and studied the pictures some more. These owls are very pretty, she said carefully, as if not to offend them. But my owl doesn't look like them. He's special. And with that unsettling description, I decided that we should call it a day. I was worried that she was getting bored with painting lessons and was maybe making up some stories to get attention. I told her to go play with her friend next door, hoping that that would help her unwind. This left me alone as my Aunt Ruth was still at work. I decided to grab my camera and see if I could spot any owls. Aunt Ruth's house was at the foothills of Appalachia, and the forest around it was absolutely stunning. It wasn't completely in the middle of nowhere. A 5-minute walk in either direction up the road would get you to the next houses over, but if you went straight back behind the house and up the hills, it was pure wilderness. I went to school in the city, so it was a literal breath of fresh air for me to spend my summer here. I was studying art, and I was pretty decent at landscape painting, so Aunt Ruth was acting like it was a big favor for me to come and spend the summer with her and help tutor Minnie. Really, though, spending time in a lovely little house in the woods and eating home-cooked meals every night was the best vacation I could have asked for. I walked the game trails I knew, following creeks when I went off trails so I wouldn't get lost. I came upon a family of 3 deer grazing and snapped a few pictures before I spooked them. A bit later, I got some awesome close-up shots of a red-tailed hawk perched in a pine tree. I also snapped more creek and forest pictures than I would ever realistically get time to paint. I didn't see any owls, but that was all right. That night, I coaxed Minnie into telling her mother about her owl over dinner. I expected Aunt Ruth to find it a bit funny the way I did, but she looked worried. I asked her about it after Minnie went to bed. I mean, she's got to just be making stuff up because she's bored, right? I asked. I think maybe we've been pushing her too hard. My little Minerva will let you know if she's bored, trust me. She'll say it in the middle of company. It's awful. We shared a laugh at that. But I don't like what she was saying. I'm not saying I believe her, but, well, when you live out here, you see some strange things. Ruth crossed her arms at that and frowned a bit. Like what? I asked, perhaps too eager to hear about any creepy happenings. Hun, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. She smiled just a bit. Aunt Ruth always looked younger when she smiled. I would, I promise, I said. Listen, Sally, Aunt Ruth said. When you see something strange or unnatural out in the woods, it's not always for other people to hear about. It sounds silly to talk about, and then you start to believe it less the more you tell it. You feel a need to throw in stuff about how maybe you really saw something else, or maybe you were drinking that night, and it's important not to do that. Sometimes it's important to keep something to yourself so you remember it really happened the way it happened. That way you take it seriously if you ever see it again. I could understand that a bit. I'd had my share of scares in the creepy old house I lived in as a kid. Doors opening, things moving when no one was home, stuff like that. Whenever I told someone, well, I had to do it as kind of a joke, even though I was a child. It gave me so many nightmares. Aunt Ruth knew all about that. My mom and her talked all the time. I think I know what you mean, I told her. You remember the house we lived in back when I was a kid? The one with all the ghosts? I said, wiggling my fingers in a silly way at broaching the spooky subject of ghosts. I do, she said, and I remember your mother being terrified. She laughs about it now, but back then she didn't think it was funny. Aunt Ruth smiled and wiggled her fingers back at me. And neither did you, not while it was happening. That night, Minnie fell asleep with her paintbrushes all over the place. I couldn't judge. There were nights when I'd left oil paint to cure on my brushes when I was tired. A cardinal sin amongst some artists. I decided to clean them for her so she could get a fresh start whenever she was feeling up to it in the morning. It was just tempera paint, which came out really easily with water and a bit of dish soap. The bathroom in Aunt Ruth's house had a window in it. It had always creeped me out. She insisted that we were in the middle of the woods, so it didn't matter that it wasn't covered. While I was cleaning the brushes, though, I deliberately faced away from it. I was cleaning a bunch of little brushes at once, rubbing them over the inside of my palm in small circles to get the soap out. They started making a quiet squeaking sound. Something about the soap and the bristles makes that noise if you're really scrubbing them. Since I was washing a bunch of little ones at once, it sounded like a flock of tiny birds in the palm of my hand. I don't know why, but I very quickly got the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned to face the door and saw neither Minnie nor Ruth, so that left only that awful window. I took a deep breath, stilling my heart for whatever I might see. I was imagining a person with a crowbar ready to smash the window and come in, or perhaps a bear upright and curious, separated from me by only a thin pane of glass. But when I looked up, it wasn't a man or a bear, but something much worse. I felt a jolt go up my spine, like I'd missed a step, and my brain was just trying to catch up. It was little Minnie's owl, and I quickly realized that I was wrong. She'd done an excellent job in capturing his likeness. The thing looking in the window had the pale face of a barn owl, but the eyes were bigger, taking up more of the face than they should. It was hard to see in the dark, but it did look very gray, not white and gold. I realized with a sick feeling that it didn't appear to be perched. In fact, it looked very, very large enough to have its feet on the ground, just like Minnie had said. It cocked its head as I examined it, and there was a definitive, almost human-like neck there. I didn't dare get any closer, but if Minnie was right, and it was touching the ground, it had to be 3 or 4 feet tall. It shuffled its wings. They looked heavy and devoid of any down, and they were thick near the base, like it had arms hiding just below the surface. I thought for a moment that it had to be someone in a costume, but the way it moved, that just didn't seem possible. I stepped back towards the hall, and it reached out with its wing to touch the glass. As it made contact, I saw 3 long, lanky, clawed fingers coming out of the joint of its wing. After that, I ran straight to bed. I pulled my blinds shut and ran 2 long strips of masking tape down the sides to keep them all the way closed. I don't know why I didn't try to get Aunt Ruth. I should have, but I was an adult too, and what was she going to do? Would she even believe me? I should have at least taken a picture. I don't know how long it took me to fall asleep, but I must have at some point. The next day, when I woke up, I had convinced myself that there was a rational explanation. It was either a person in a costume and I was just scared out of my wits, or it was some kind of mutant. That kind of thing happens in the real world, after all. It didn't mean there was anything supernatural going on. Which brought me to the third option, that there was indeed something otherworldly happening. But I kind of filed that away as the least likely possibility. But a possibility nonetheless. Aunt Ruth had gotten into my head a bit with her talk of things that shouldn't be discussed in the hills. Daylight has a way of making things that are scary at night feel silly. The shadow in your closet becomes just a coat that's fallen, and the beast in the woods is almost always a stray cat or squirrel, and the monster you see peering through your window at night could be a very interesting photo subject during the day. The way I saw it, if it was something supernatural, it wouldn't be lurking around during the day. It would probably be near the house anyway, not the woods. Plus, I'd been exploring in the woods all summer, and I really should be more worried about the bears than some big, weird owl. Over coffee, I asked Aunt Ruth if I could take the day off to explore, and she readily agreed. I think she was happy to give Minnie a break too, and keep her from making more awful nightmare paintings. I should have told her about the owl. She probably would have believed me. But despite our recent conversation, I would have felt silly talking about it. I could already feel myself taking the seriousness out of the encounter just by going over and over it in my own head. Perhaps if I was going to venture into the woods, I should do it while I was taking the situation as seriously as I could. I set out that day with a spare battery for my camera, some snacks, water, and bear mace. There were sycamores down by the creek with massive hollow trunks that would have been an ideal nesting site, so I started there. The trees as a whole were lovely with peeling bark and those big, starry leaves. I didn't spot any owls hiding in the clusters, though. I even turned the flash on my camera and took a few pictures up some of the holes in the trunks. The trees were cold inside, and each time a flash went off, I was expecting to see that big, pale face staring down at me, waiting for talons to grab my hands in the dark. That night at dinner, I thought passively about the owl visiting again. Part of me felt as if I'd probably just made the whole encounter up. Perhaps it had even been just a vivid dream, though when I went to bed, my blinds were still taped shut. I was feeling so bold, so sure that I'd just imagined the whole thing that I went and took the tape off. I didn't wake up to anything peering through my window that night. No, I woke up to Aunt Ruth screaming. Minnie was gone. Ruth called the police. She tried to insist on going to the woods herself to look for her, but I convinced her that someone needed to be here to answer questions. I told her I would go instead. I took my bear mace, my flashlight, and I ventured into the dark. I didn't think to grab my camera. I started thinking then about the brief possibility that I'd considered earlier, that the creature Minnie was so fond of was really just a person in a costume. I'd been quick to dismiss it, but what if someone had stolen her? The idea of a person dressing up like that and peering into a child's window at night was horrifying. I'd like to say the seriousness of the situation quelled any fears I had of being in the woods in the dark, but that would be a lie. I wanted to be heroically marching through the forest, hell-bent on my mission of finding Minnie, but instead I was stepping lightly and flinching at every noise. There's something primal in your brain that tells you not to be out in the woods at night, and that doesn't shut off for anything. I decided to follow the creek. I was hoping the sycamores would be my best bet to find the creature. Plus, the likelihood of getting lost at night was no doubt much greater, and the creek would be impossible to miss. Progress was very slow, but eventually I made my way to the sycamores. I stood and listened, and eventually I called out, "Minnie! Minnie! It's Sally! Can you hear me?" I realized I should have been calling out this whole time, but I'd been trying to be as quiet as possible without even thinking about it, like I was instinctively hiding from something. I moved on further, just a bit, and then I heard it start up all at once, screaming. It sounded like dozens of children all screaming at once, or perhaps a whole litter of kittens being slaughtered. Against all of my better instincts, I ran towards the sound. Well, more like stumbled. The brush was thick. It pulled at my hair and snagged my jacket, thorns scraping my arms, and then all of a sudden I was out. What I'd stumbled into was a clearing in the trees. It was lit clearly by the full moon, and the stars above were unspoilt by light pollution. But a single shooting star overhead was more impressive than both of those. It was the first thing I looked at, a massive orange streak of fire across the sky. It looked so close as it flew past, and I heard a kind of whistling and crackling sound. Soon, though, it was out of my sight past the tree line, and with the spectacle gone, my eyes finally focused on what was happening inside the trees. There must have been dozens of them, a whole flock of barn owls perched in the trees at the edge of the clearing. As my eyes adjusted, I saw a human form just a yard or so away, and as I got closer, I recognized Minnie. "Sally, be quiet," she whispered, coming closer to me. She looked calm, or even a bit excited about the spectacle. Just then, we heard the meteor land off in the distance with a boom that shook the ground and made us both reach for our ears. The sound of the meteor gone, I heard the owls screaming uninterrupted once again. I knew barn owls didn't hoot, but
I hadn't imagined their calls would sound nearly as awful as this. Minnie directed me toward what they were watching. In the center of the clearing was Minnie's owl. "He's doing a dance," she told me. She gave a little smile about her friend's performance. He was most certainly not dancing. The owl looked big, even bigger than the last time I'd seen him 2 nights ago. It was a large clearing, so it was hard to get a sense of scale, but he looked taller than me, and what he was doing looked more like writhing. There were indeed clawed humanoid fingers at the joints on the end of his wings. He had long, scaly legs, taking him in slow, pained steps in a circle. All the while he was shaking his body. There were white and gray down feathers falling off of him as he went, piling up on the ground. The feathers falling off revealed more of what was hiding underneath. Most of the feathers were gone off of its face now. He had big black eyes, bigger than any owl's, like some kind of alien. His wings had a thick, bony structure along the ridge that I don't think was normal for owls. Their bones were supposed to be light. It looked as if the wings were growing bigger, but it was hard to tell with the stunted, painful movements it was making. A long screech echoed through the clearing, and some of the other owls quieted. One of the ordinary owls flew down, landing close to the monster in the middle of the circle. The lone owl screeched again, and I wondered if this had been the creature's mate. Owls usually stick together for life, after all. I wondered if she'd have a history with him, had children. Had this owl been normal before whatever transformation it was going through took over? Or was it something that had only ever been pretending to be an owl? The bold owl flew the short distance to the creature and perched on his shoulder, and I was finally able to get a true sense of scale. The thing looked about 10 times bigger than the others. It had grown to be taller than Millie, maybe even taller than me. As the female owl struggled to keep balance on the creature's shoulder, it snapped the creature out of its spell, stopping it cold. The beast looked at her for a second, like it was trying to recognize her and failing, and then it lashed out with an awful clawed hand, the talons looking so much more pronounced than they were when they had landed on the bathroom window such a short time ago. The owl who'd tried to help the creature fell to the ground, and the other owls grew quiet. And with that, the creature let out a sound that did not resemble the screams of the other owls. Strangely enough, it let out a long, low hooting sound. Not a sound that barn owls ever really made. It sounded bad and wrong, like it was a person trying desperately to make the sound it thought an owl would make. It let out the sound again, longer this time, and with that the other owls quieted and began taking flight. The first few that took off ignited the others, and soon the flock was fleeing. They flew in the direction the comet had gone. The creature watched them for a second, and then turned his eyes to the only ones who couldn't fly away. It looked to us. Minnie had grown quiet, and for the first time she seemed worried. "Why did he hit the other owl?" she asked. Her voice quivered with concern as the creature began taking tentative, painful steps towards us. As it got closer, I got a better look at the molted gray skin beneath the sparse feathers that still clung to its face. Its flesh looked smooth and gray as it shone in the moonlight, and that snapped me out of my trance. I grabbed Minnie's arm and squeaked, "Run!" She listened, thank God. We stumbled through the brush, the thorns catching us both, but we didn't care. Behind us, we heard the low, deep hooting sound, right as we burst through the trees to the creek. We were able to go faster then, splashing through the water and stumbling over the gravelly sand. I heard the hooting behind us once again, but it didn't sound like it was getting closer. As we approached the house, we saw blue and red lights, and Minnie yelled out, "Mom!" We sprinted into the embrace of Aunt Ruth. When things calmed down a bit, I lied to the cops. I had to, even though I knew Minnie would have been telling them about what really happened. I said I'd found her in the woods and we'd gotten spooked by an owl defending its nest. If I had told them what really happened, they'd think I'd been doing drugs with a small child in tow. After they left, I told Ruth everything.
She seemed skeptical, but accepted our story nonetheless. The next morning, Penny was still mad at me for lying to the police, and I caught her trying to sneak off into the woods. She told me she was going to see if her owl and his wife were okay. I managed to talk her out of it, only under the promise that I would go look myself. I could have just hung about at the edge of the tree line for a while and told her I'd checked, but once again, the daylight and Aunt Ruth's skepticism had me watering down the last night's events in my head. I was feeling curious, in a way that would probably get me killed someday. I wanted some answers about what had happened, if there were any to be found. When I got to the clearing, the owls were gone from the trees. I walked up to the feather pile and found a tiny body lying among the down. I couldn't be certain, but I suspected it had been the mate of Minnie's owl, the one who he'd hit, who couldn't fly away. There wasn't any way to tell her apart from the other owls, so I couldn't be sure, and even if she had some defining feature, there wasn't much left of her. Something had eaten most of the meat off her bones. I decided to bury her. I'm not sure why. I felt a sort of strange connection with her because I'd witnessed whatever had happened that night. There was a piece of slate nearby that served as a good shovel, and the ground was soft from a recent rain, so it didn't take long. By the time I'd finished, I looked up and saw 2 owls perched in the tree above me. I wondered if owls remembered who had raised them. Did they mourn the dead? Maybe they'd been this owl's young. I nodded to them as I left. One of them looked like its eyes were just a little too big, and that made me walk faster. On the walk back, I wondered about what had happened. Perhaps there was some kind of parasite that had taken over the owl, or maybe some strange disease that made it turn monstrous. When you really think about it, rabies is like something out of a horror movie, but it only affects mammals. Maybe there's some kind of bird equivalent? But with how quickly Minnie's owl had changed, the strange noises he made, that didn't seem to fit right. I started to think about the stories that we humans have that seemed similar to what I'd seen. Werewolves, zombies, and vampires. Stories that involve monstrous transformations or cannibalism in one form or another. There weren't really stories about animals turning into monsters like that, at least as far as I knew, but animals couldn't really talk to each other the same way we can. They can't pass down stories about monsters and supernatural events. They can't warn each other. The owls who had seen what happened would remember, and perhaps it would foster a distrust of their own kind among them. But really, if what I'd witnessed had happened before or would happen again, it wouldn't make the pages of owl history, because such a thing just didn't exist. Maybe other animals have monsters too. They just can't tell each other about them. When I got back, Minnie was painting again. This time the subject matter was less scary. It was the comet from last night. I wondered if in her head she was already erasing what had happened, convincing herself that it was just a dream. But maybe she was still young enough to believe her own eyes, even if they told her things that did not seem possible. I sat with her and told her that the owls were all gone, and she seemed less worried than she had that morning. She said, "That's good. They probably all flew away then." "So if the owl comes back again, are you going to go with him?" I asked her. "No," she said, working in some blue and purple into the night sky, making it prettier than it had been in real life. "Why not?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral so she wouldn't lie to me. I needed to know if she was going to put herself in any danger. "I don't think I should be friends with him anymore. When he was being all weird last night, it was kind of scary," Minnie replied. "Did he come up to your window at all last night?" I asked her. "No, but I closed my blinds now, and Mom said I shouldn't make friends with animals because they can be dangerous. I think she might be right." "I think she might be right too," I said. I grabbed a few brushes and started painting as well. My subject was one of the big sycamores I'd grown so fond of. I'd had enough of owls. I hoped that Minnie had too, but I worried that as the years passed, she'd forget about her owl and about the things that can lurk in the woods. Sitting there on the floor, I made a promise to myself. that when she was older, I would tell her about the state I'd found the dead owl in. I'd tell her that it had all been real if she ever started to convince herself it had just been a childhood fantasy. I know now that monsters can be real, and when she's older, I'm going to make sure she remembers that too. Because not all animals can warn each other about the terrors that are out there, but we can. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Podcast Inside Your House. To hear every tale of terror as they're released, subscribe to our show on your podcast app or on YouTube. And until next time, take a second to remember what all the people close to you are like. The world changes a bit every day, and one morning you might just not recognize them.